Hey, welcome back to this mini series. Here's where we left off, and today I'm going to show you how to create something like that. So we're going to aim for this type of stuff. Obviously, you're going to be working on something very different from mine, but the techniques that I'm going to show you are really cool, and then you can utilize them to create anything that that your design requires, anything that you like. It doesn't have to be this type of design. So let's go ahead and start with a breakdown of this. And you see I have a bunch of folders and layers, but it might be a little bit scary to see all of these things, but are really, really simple stuff. So let's go ahead and start with the base layer. So I just went ahead and created this fill layer, which is ultimately just a color layer, just like I showed you in the previous lesson. So nothing else, just the color layer. And because it doesn't have any other channel, you see that if I get closer, some of the roughness and the nice details that we set up in the previous lesson are coming through really nicely. So you can treat this layer as the paint layer or the base of the paint layer, right? And it could be any color that you want. Like I said, we're setting up in a non-destructive workflow. So at any point, we can come back and change this to any color that we want. Now, the next layer that I have is this black layer that is defining kind of like the outline or part of the outline of my head. And if I select the layer, you see it just has the color and the roughness, right? I just added a little bit of roughness just to differentiate it a little bit from the rest. But other than that, the main difference is the mask or how I set up the mask. So if I click on the mask here, you see I have a bunch of paint layers and a blur. So I'm gonna go one by one and I'm gonna show you how to set it up. So the first one is just this very rough pass just to have an idea of what I'm going to be creating. The second one is a clean pass to have a very nice set of edges. The third line or the third paint layer is going to be for this sort of like the teeth or the pattern for the teeth. And the blur is just giving me a slight bit of blur, you see, so that it's not as perfect. And that's about it really. So let's go ahead and set this up, maybe collapse this for now. And actually I'm gonna duplicate the base layer because that's pretty simple. So holding Alt and just duplicating like so. And I'm going to put it into a new folder. And of course, I'm not going to repeat every single layer that I've set up already in here, but I'm going to give you the tools and the workflow so that you can replicate it. And at the end of the day, it's a very repetitive process once you get the hang of it. So let's go ahead and create a new layer here. Again, holding the Alt key to select just color and the roughness. And I'm going to make this a black color. All right. So now that I have this, I'm going to call this, let's call it skull so that we know what it is. And let's bring in a black mask just to hide it. And then we can bring in a paint layer. So let's go ahead and click on this add paint layer. And now we can go ahead and start painting with a white color just to paint the areas of the mask that we want to reveal this black color. And that's pretty much what we have. Now let's go ahead and undo that and set it up a little bit better. At the top of the interface, you have this icon to set up symmetry. So that way you can basically work a bit faster if you have a symmetrical object. So in this case, it works fine. If you don't want to see the middle line or this red line here, you can click on this icon and let's click on hide while painting, or you can also show or not show intersection. So I prefer to work without it. There's an extra cursor on each side, so I know that I'm using symmetry when I'm working. All right, so the basics of the workflow is already what I just showed you. You can just create these paint layers and start painting. Now, the way that you approach the painting of the mask, that is what could vary. So right now on the left-hand side, I have my paintbrush, which is selected by default, but you also have this awesome new tool called the Paint Along Path. We're gonna get to that in a second. And you also have this one, which is the polygon fill. So if I click on this one, and you see that I get the wireframe for the 3D mesh, and I can just go ahead and click and drag and basically paint based on the polygons. So let's undo that because there is another way that this polygon fill can work with. So if you see at the top here, it has triangles, it has quads, it has this one that is allowing you to select the entire mesh fill, and this one that has the UVs. So if I click on the mesh and click on that, you see it just selects the entire mesh because this is a single mesh. Let's undo that. And if I click on this one, it allows you to select pieces based on the UVs. So to understand a little bit of the UV layout, let's go ahead and click on this icon right here and switch between the 3D only to 2D and 3D. And you can also press the tab on your keyboard to go into a full screen to see both. And you see this is basically how this 3D object is unwrapped in the 2D space, right? So I can go ahead and click here. And because I had this UV island selected, I'm only selecting this UV island. So that is pretty much what I want. All right, let's go ahead and go back to what we had before. So let's press tab and let's switch this back to 3D only. All right. Now I want to go ahead and switch from the UV island to this one right here, which is polygon fill. And I'm going to invert the color, right? So you can press the letter X on your keyboard to switch between a black or a white color. That's ultimately what we're doing. We're painting a black and white mask. So if I press X, you see that this slider changes to black. between black and white. So again, you can just use this slider or you can just use the shortcut. So I'm just going to use that black now to click and drag, and I'm going to hide a portion of this. Something like this. I think that's roughly what I use. All right, perfect. Now let's go ahead and select the paintbrush. Now I'm going to switch back to the black color to keep painting this a little bit better, but I don't want this brush that is very, very soft, which in some cases works nicely for different things. But right now we're going to try to go for a more well-defined edge between the blue and the black. So let's undo that and let's change this brush. So let's go ahead and close this filter here. And let's go ahead and click on the brushes. So this one shows you all the brushes that are available to you. So I'm going to scroll slowly until I get to this basic brush or the basic hard and click on it once. And you see that that changes. And obviously everything or the settings for this brush changes as well. So now if I paint, we're painting with a hard brush. So what I like to do now is kind of like roughly define sort of like the cheekbones of the character. This is going to be rough. Don't worry about it. We're going to change it in a bit. And maybe something like that for the bottom. And again, I'm going to press the X to change it and refine it a little bit more. All right. So that's it. That's what I want to do. But of course, this is not perfect. This is just a reference so that we can then polish it. So the next layer that we're going to do is to polish this. So let's click on this icon, add another paint layer. And this time I'm going to introduce you to an awesome new tool from Painter, which is this one right here. So the paint along path. So I'm going to click on that one. And if you're familiar with Illustrator or Photoshop, it is the same way as creating paths and painting along those paths. So it is really, really cool. When you select it, you see there is this section here in the interface that appears. Right now we don't have any path, but we can go ahead and create a couple. So the cool thing is that you can select any brush to paint with this path. So I'm just going to use the default one just to show you. And I'm going to click here to create a point. And actually, I just want to use a black color. So I can just go to the grayscale here or the properties of this brush and just reduce it to black. Let's go ahead and click on that one. And it created a point, as you can see. Let's go ahead and create another one in here. And right now it's creating a straight line. But as soon as I create another point, it becomes a Bezier curve. So I'm going to click on that one right now. Perfect. And then let's go ahead and click on this one right here. And you see this one is becoming, a very curvy Bezier curve. We're gonna change it in just a bit. Let's continue with the path around here maybe, and let's go ahead and do one more in there. All right, so it's looking okay, but we can definitely fix this. So the first thing I want to do is select this one right here, this point, and here at the top you have this icon to toggle between the corner and the smooth. So I'm going to click on that to make it a corner. So now we have this sort of nicer shape, but we still have to change the blurriness of this stroke. So all we have to do is with this selected, with the path selected, and you know that it's selected because it's highlighted in blue, we're going to go ahead and change this to this brush right here. So just clicking on the hard brush, you see that it gets updated and the entire path gets updated. This is awesome because you can just go ahead and play around with a bunch of different brushes and it's essentially changing the stroke pattern, right? So this is really, really fun. I had a lot of fun just playing around with this. But let's stick with the basics so that it is easy to understand this workflow. Let's click on basic hard. There we go. And the other thing is that as I did it, it created a pretty large profile for the brush. That's another thing that is really, really easy to change with this tool. You can simply go to the top of the properties here of this brush and you can change the size on the fly like so. So this is really, really awesome. All right, so I'm going to leave it to something like that and then just go ahead and refine the placement of these points, right? So basically, just as a quick summary, as I changed this, what I did before was to set up a starting point just to fill the areas that I wanted to refine. And then I'm using a single stroke, in this case, to refine that edge. So let's just polish this one a bit more. And I think that works really well. So basically, if I turn this second one, you'll see this is the kind of like the reference fill. And now we have this nice look. Now, this is really awesome because all we're doing is creating a mask. So if I press the Alt key, this is my mask, but it is a dynamic mask. So all of these layers or all of these effects that I'm creating are within this layer, right? So this is really cool. All right, let's go back and let's continue with the next one, which is also another really cool technique. I'm going to create a new paint layer. And by the way, you don't have to create multiple paint layers. You can have multiple paths within one paint layer, as you will see in just a second. But I like to keep everything separate so that I have more control over different areas of the mask. All right, so for this one, I'm going to go ahead and replicate the same idea. I'm going to click on this one and oops, let's go ahead and make sure we make it a white color. This time I'm going to subtract. So let's click on this one and then this one. All right, so we have a straight line. Let's push it a bit closer. And this time I want to reduce the size to something like that. And once I have established the length, what I can do is click in between and you see I can add a point. So let's go ahead and push this actually down and this one as well. All right, so I can use this simple path to define the mouth so I can open it and close it. So that is the idea. So let's just establish it like maybe something like that. And now I'm going to do a couple more paths within this paint layer. So I'm going to press the Enter key to log that in. And if I open this drop down, you see I have the first path. You can also double click them here to select them and to name them. So I'm going to call this mouth. Right? Let's press Enter again just to lock it in. And let's go ahead and create a couple of lines for the teeth. So I'm going to start here at the top and then click here and then here. And again, we can just turn this into sort of like corners like so. And let's press Enter. Let's do the same thing here. 1, 2, and 3. I want to select the center, make it into a corner, press Enter, and then I'm going to do one in the middle. Now for the middle, instead of doing double, what you can do is toggle off the symmetry and just do one roughly in the middle. Like so, press Enter. And now we have different paths. As you can see, we have 4 different paths in total that make up this mouth. All right, so now the next thing that I want to do is, if you look at my example previously, it has this nice tapering effect. That is not necessarily anything to do with the brush itself that I chose. You can change that as well on the fly. So that's what I want to show you. So let's go ahead and turn this on again. And I'm going to go ahead and select this one right here. And if I go ahead and change the size with this selected, it's not going to change the size of this particular point. It's going to change the thickness of the entire stroke. To change this particular point, you can go here at the top where the pressure slider is. So this is basically, if you have a tablet with a pen, you can actually do this by hand, but this pressure allows you to play around with this as well. So I'm going to reduce that. Let's go ahead and click on this one and reduce that as well. It's as simple as that. Let's go ahead and press Enter. Let's select another path and let's go ahead and repeat the process. So as you can see, once you get the hang of it, once you understand what the basics of this workflow are, you can just have a lot of fun with this. And it is actually really simple, but very repetitive. All right, let's click Enter. And now let's switch to a different layer so that we can see this a bit better. We have the basics of the skull. And what's really cool about all of this is, like I said, it is a non-destructive workflow, so we can come back and change things at any time. So if I go ahead and select the third paint layer and select the mouth, again, I can just go ahead and make it larger or smaller. And that is something that I can do after if I want to refine the look and feel of my character. All right, so now let's go ahead and move on into a slightly more advanced technique, but again, using the same very simple principles. So you see, it's ultimately really simple. It's just that it requires a little bit more setup. So let's go ahead and create a new layer. So I'm going to click on Fill Layer. I want to call this one Eyes and Nose. And I'm going to hold the Alt key, make sure that it's just the color, and I'm going to make this a black color as well. We can also add a bit of roughness just to override that for a bit. We can come back later on and retrieve some of the details that we set up in the base material, but that's going to be for a different lesson. All right, so following the same steps for the workflow that I've given you, let's go ahead and click on this icon to create a black mask to hide it, and then click on the magic wand and create a paint. All right, so now this is a paint layer. Again, we can just use any type of painting to create the mask. So I'm going to use this one to create the eyes. I'm going to click once, and it is very, very tiny. Right? But I just click once. So this is just to show you that usually when you think about path, you think about a very, very nicely defined line, but it could also be used with a single vertex or a single point. So that's what I did. I'm only creating one point, a single click, and then I'm going to use this size to change the size of my eyes. So you see, it's kind of like a really cool way of working that way. So I'm going to establish the size of the eyes, something like that. And then of course you can just click on that point and move the eyes around. Now, the position of the eyes or where you place them around the face can play a big part in the way that you read the character. So you put them closely like so. It's more like a cute, maybe silly character, whereas if you push them away, it becomes a bit more weird. So just play around with the placement. I'm going to stick with something simple like that so that I can play around with other things that I want to show you. All right, so that is it for the eyes. I'm going to go ahead and hit Enter, and I'm going to add another paint layer, and this is going to be for the nose. So for the nose, I'm going to do something very simple as well. So I'm going to click once and then twice. Again, very, very big. So I'm going to reduce it. So I just have one stroke, but because I have symmetry, sort of like creating this sort of triangle. And what I want to do is click on the top one and go to pressure and reduce the pressure. So it, creates this more of a heart shape. And again, you can just play around with the overall size, the placement of that, make it a bit flatter, or something like this, right? So again, this is more about the workflow itself, and then you can have fun playing around with this type of details or the placement. And that's it. Let's go ahead and press enter. Now, if you remember in the previous lesson, I covered the height map very briefly. So I'm going to continue with that, and I'm just going to show you something else that you can do with that. So let's go ahead and click on the actual layer. So right now we have color, but we can also enable the height map right here. And you notice that I also have this ambient occlusion. I forgot to mention that, but you can just go to texture settings and click on this icon here and add the ambient occlusion channel. We're not going to use it right now, but it is in there just in case you see something different from what I had in the previous lesson. All right, so I just enable hide as well, and we have the hide slider. So I can push this in and out, right? So the cool thing about this is that it generates that sort of like depth in the character. And if you don't see this working straight away for you, it's because I have enabled something else. So let's just push it all the way to -1. And if I click on this icon right here, which is the shader settings, you see that I have a couple of tabs. If I click on the second one, this is my displacement and tessellation. So if I enable or disable this, I will be able to see this a bit better. So if I disable it right now, the effect that you're getting is kind of like a fake effect based on the light. So if I just go, it looks like there's a little bit of depth, but if I just push it towards the side, there's literally no depth. It's just an effect of the light. But if I enable a true displacement, like so, what is happening is actually that the software is pushing the geometry in, right? So you can change the scale of the height. So I'm gonna copy these values because that's the ones that I wanna keep, but you can change this and you see it is actually creating, or not creating, but it's gonna push or extrude that geometry, right? And it creates all of these triangles all around it because obviously there's not enough information around this area. So that is where this subdivision count comes into play. Now, 15 is already a pretty high number. I wouldn't advise to go like, beyond that. In fact, let's just set it to 16. And you see that changes a little bit. But if I just reduce it even more, it becomes a little bit harder to see all of that. So I'm going to set it to 16. And we have enough resolution in there. And then for the scale, I'm going to set it back to what it was, 0.01. And this is going to be the scale of the height for the overall object. However, I will be able to push this even further using levels. So I just wanted to show you that once it's set up, once you enable the height map, and then you enable it here and set these parameters like so, you will be able to play around with the depth of all the details that you want a little bit more. So let's collapse this. And with the layer selected, you see it has this blue outline. I'm going to click on the magic wand icon and click on levels. And in the levels, you see we also have a drop down in here. So this is something that is slightly different when you have a levels in the mask because, when you have levels in the mask, you're only affecting a black and white image. However, when you add the levels to a layer, you will have the different channels that are available to you in any fill layer. So what I'm going to do is target the height channel. Right? So these are the levels for the height channel, and I can just go ahead and play around with that. And you see, I'm kind of like exaggerating that depth. So I'm going to push this quite a bit. And the cool thing about all of this is that because this is just a mask, I can just come back to the eyes, select my path, and then I can just move it around. And I'm just literally, changing the placement of this, the height map. So that is really, really cool. Now you see that it's still not perfect, and we can just go ahead and fix this really quickly. So in the mask itself, I'm going to click on the magic wand, and I'm going to use a filter, and I'm going to use a blur filter. So the blur automatically sort of blurs things a little bit, and that helps to, refine the edges a little bit, and we can just play with the amount. So maybe not that much. I'm going to push it to 0.006 or 0.06. There we go. All right. So that looks good. Now, the next step at this point would be to start adding some really cool ornaments and designs around the face, right? And we're going to use the same technique. So let's go ahead and collapse this by clicking on the layer, and I'm going to click on a new layer, and again, holding the Alt key, pressing the color channel, and we're going to select any random color that you want to use, right? It could be anything. I'm going to go for an orangey color like so, right? And do the same thing, just the black mask, and this time the paint layer. So as you can see, the setup of any new layer, it is basically the same thing. The main thing that changes is the mask that I'm going to add, and obviously the color in this case. So let's go ahead and create some ornaments around the eyes. So I'm just going to go ahead and click once in here, This is pretty big, so let's just reduce it a tiny bit. And let's click another time in here, and another one there, and a fourth one here. And if you want to close this path, you don't have to click on the end. You can just go here at the top, and in this icon, it allows you to close the path. So you can click on that, and you see it just closes the path. So this is probably not perfect in terms of the circular shape. So what I want to do is add some in between. So in between this and this, I'm going to click once. Same thing here. Just click in first, and then I can just push them like so. So obviously, you can spend a bit more time making sure that this is more accurate or more rounded. But this is just a very simple way of doing it. All right, so I have my path, but I want to have something different than just this, this set of stroke. Obviously, I can change the size and all of that like I just showed you, but I wanted something more like a pattern, right? So one thing that we can do is change the spacing. So here in the spacing of the settings of this stroke, I can change the amount of, kind of like instances of this brush. So this is kind of like a simple way of generating a cool pattern. So I'm going to do something like this, maybe. And then we can just go ahead and play around with the position of these points just to space them out a bit. All right, so that looks pretty cool. Now you see that this orange is sort of like bleeding inside the eye, and I don't want that. And I'm going to show you a really cool technique that we can reuse later on. But I'm going to show you a couple more things that we can do with paths before I show you how to fix this sort of like bleeding into the eye. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click and duplicate this layer. So I have exactly the same thing. Now I'm going to click on the orange color, and I'm going to go for a different one. Let's go for a dark blue. All right, so it is essentially the same thing. And I'm going to do it one more time just to show you another way of working. So duplicate it another time. And for this one, I'm going to go for maybe a yellowish tone. All right, something like that. Again, you can totally decide what to do with this. So let's turn them off and except the blue one. Let's go to the path in here. And let's say that we don't want this specific pattern, right? We can select it and maybe let's increase the size. You see, just changing the pattern already. And obviously, we can just change the spacing as well, right? Something like that. And we can go ahead and start playing around with the position of these points. So I want to try to get everything or every single point that I had in the previous path inside the eye. So basically, the only bits that we will see, I did it in the wrong camera, but everything that we're seeing right now is kind of like the edge of the brush just going outside of the eye. So hopefully that makes sense. It will make a bit more sense once I finish, I hope. All right, so let's go ahead and play around with the size again. And then we can play with the spacing one more time. All right, so you see it's kind of like creating, if you look at the right-hand side, it's kind of like creating almost like a flower shape on top of the previous one. And this is one of the main things that you can replicate throughout the entire design if you're following along. It's basically, stacking layers on top of each other. And basically, depending on the position of the layer stack, you can just hide them or, override certain details. So if I push this below, that's not necessarily what I want. So I'm just going to leave it in there. And that's how I do it. Now, with this yellow one, we can go ahead and do something else. Let's go ahead and select this guy right here. And this time I'm going to select the path and I'm going to reduce the amount of points just to show you something else. You can click on this one and hit delete. So these are the extra points that I generated before. But this time I'm going to push it out and I'm going to play with the size. Let's keep playing with the size a little bit more. But instead of having just a circular shape, I want to start bringing in something more interesting. So maybe like a triangular shape or something like that, right? And that has to do with the alpha or the tip of the brush. So let's go ahead and click on this icon right here next to the brushes. And these are the library of alphas that comes with Painter. So you have a bunch of really cool things that you can use. I'm going to keep it simple, like I said. Let's use this arrowhead smooth. And let's go ahead and scroll down in here where it says alpha. And I'm going to go ahead and click and drag and drop it. Now, if for some reason when you drag and drop something, it doesn't change, make sure that your path is selected. I had it selected, so that's why it changed like so. And then we can go ahead and maybe play with the size again and maybe the spacing a tiny bit. And one of the cool things that you can do as well with paths is that whatever you have as your alpha can actually follow the direction of the path. Right now, it's just placing it, in the same sort of angle. But we can go ahead and click on this button that says follow path. And now this triangle is sort of like following the path. I actually don't mind this pattern, but maybe we can just go ahead and change the angle. So let's click on that one and let's play around with maybe the other way around, creating kind of like a, yeah, something like this. This pattern is not too bad. And again, we can just go ahead and play again with the size, the spacing, and then we can just also reposition some of these points. All right, so really fun stuff, but we still have this sort of like color bleeding into the eye, and that's not really the look that I'm going for, right? It's also, if you look at the nose, the nose or the back of the nose is the only one that has the black color and not the inside of this wall in here. So I'm going to show you how to fix that. One of the things that you can do is just create another black layer. Let's go ahead and hold the Alt key just to select the color, go to black, right? Create a black mask, and then a paint layer, and then you can start using the paint one just to paint on top, right? But there is a much more precise and faster way of doing it using anchor points. So let's go ahead and undo that. And we're gonna create an anchor point for the eyes. So let's go ahead and keep things very simple. I'm gonna turn everything off. And going back to what I had here with the eyes. The anchor points, what they do really is just reference one layer to another, or the mask of one layer into the other. So right now, if I hold the Alt key, this is the mask that we generated with the, with a couple of dots for the eyes and the nose. And with anchor points, I can just reuse this mask or reference this mask and use it somewhere else. So instead of just painting it manually, I can just basically, have a duplicate of that. So let's go ahead and click on this magic one here, and I'm going to click on anchor point. Just a couple of things to know about anchor points is that whatever you reference, it has to be on top of the anchor point. In this case, just works fine because we're going to reference from this layer on top. So the anchor point is below it, so that's fine. And the other thing is that the anchor point is only going to reference whatever is below the anchor point. So if you put another effect on top, it's not going to be referenced. All right, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and enable this one right here. Right? So right now there's no effect. Let's click on the mask itself and let's go ahead and bring in a fill layer, just like we did before with the clouds and all of that for the previous material, right? So just a fill layer. But if I click on the grayscale, you'll see that we have two tabs. So we have resources, but we also have anchor points. I'm going to click on anchor point and I'm going to select these eyes and nose. These ones that you see here are from my original folder, so you can ignore them. And you can actually, if I go to the mask, you can just double click and call this whatever you want. So let's call it eyes and nose black, whatever you want. All right. And go back in here, fill layer, click on grayscale, anchor point, and I'm going to select it. All right, so as you can see, if I turn this on and off, it's kind of like there, the effect, but it is not perfect, right? So one of the things that you can do with this anchor point, with this fill layer, is that it already comes with some levels, so you can expand that, and then you can play around with these levels just to sort of like sharpen it, like so. And if you hold the Alt key and get into the mask, you see it is exactly the mask that we had for the eyes because we're just referencing this anchor point. So it's exactly the same at this point. Now, what's really cool about anchor points is that you can use that quickly as a base and then refine that mask. So that's exactly what I want to do. I want to take this current mask, right, that we sort of like anchoring or replicating from the anchor point, and I want to adjust it. So I'm going to scale that a little bit and do a couple of things just to make sure that it covers these areas. So let's go ahead and click on the mask, and I'm going to bring in an effect, or a filter. Click on filter, and we're going to look for something called the mask outline, this one right here. So as soon as I do that, you see things change a little bit. Let's go ahead and get into the mask to see what's happening. So this mask outline is going to take a look at whatever we have in, the difference between the black and white, and it's going to create an outline based on that. But you can change a couple of things. You can go for outside, you can go for inside, or you can go for both, right? So I'm just going to go for outside in this case. And I'm going to click on this start from black to be off. So that way it starts from black and then just sort of like fades out. Let's see what that does. So you see it's kind of like fading out and it's kind of like covering a little bit of that. All right, so let's go back into the mask outline, and then we can play around with some of the parameters. So I can just scale this width, and that's ultimately what is giving me that, the reach of this mask. And we can play with the threshold as well, right? So I think I'm going to play with the curve shape a little bit and maybe reduce the width to something like that. I think that's looking good already. And then, of course, we can also bring in some levels, for example. Let's click on levels, and then we can sort of like crunch these values even more, like so. All right, so it's just like playing around with the sharpness of this mask that we're creating, right? And on top of that, we can also bring in some blur. So let's bring in some blur, and we can just reduce that to 0.1 is fine. So now if I go into the mask, everything that we're doing is kind of like editing this specific mask. Let's go ahead and hold the Alt key just to enter in here. So the first one is the anchor point. Then we're using the mask outline just to generate that, that outline. And then we have the levels just to crunch these values, and the blur. Now, one thing that I'm going to show you though is that right now what I'm doing with the mask outline is overriding the original mask, right? So you see, this is the effect. But you can actually use blending modes within these filters to combine them. So let's go ahead and just leave the fill and the mask outline. You see, that is the main difference of the mask outline. I can go ahead and set this to, let's say, multiply, or I can set it to screen, which is the one that I like to use. And you see, it is instead of overriding the previous one, it's kind of like adding to it, right? So that is totally fine. Let's go ahead and use levels and blur. So now we have a slightly different mask from what we have in the eyes. And the effect is pretty good. All right, and in terms of the techniques and workflows, that is pretty much it. Now, if I go back to the, to the original file that I show you, I have a bunch of layers and of course a bunch of, details that I added. So it looks really complex, but ultimately, if I just select any of these things, you'll see they're all paths, right? So let's go ahead and select something. Let me just find it first. This one right here. It's good to name things. I forget to do that sometimes. So this one right here, it looks a little bit complex, but all it is just a purple layer, just like I've shown you before, with a black mask and a paint layer that has a path. So if I go ahead and select the path, this one right here, I can go ahead and edit this path at any point, and I can change the type of path or the type of ornament that I have with the alpha. So I think the one that I use is called, let's call it medieval. This one right here. So I use this one that comes with Painter, but I can use something else. I can just replace it with that, and there we go. We can go ahead and do the same thing that I've shown you. Play with the spacing and the size. Right? And I just completely changed the design. So as you can see, it looks a bit more complex or fairly complex just because I'm adding a bunch of layers, but they're all using the same technique. And it's totally up to you what designs or what ornaments you want to add to your character. So I'm going to leave this lesson here. And in the next one, I'm going to show you a bunch of other really cool techniques that you can incorporate into your workflow.